Ladies and gentlemen, Archivist here. I want you to visualize the most secure, most intensely monitored, and most formidable room on the planet. It isn't the Situation Room within the White House, nor is it the Strategic War Room at the Pentagon. It is the settlement desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This is the precise nerve center where the US dollar truly lives. Every major petroleum trade, every sovereign bond acquisition, and every international weapon sale flows directly through this chamber. They witness everything. If a private bank in Switzerland sneezes, a screen in New York flickers in response. But at 3:09 a.m., Riyadh time this morning, which was 7 o'clock p.m. last night in New York, something entirely impossible occurred in that room. For exactly 4 seconds, the global oil market went completely dark. On the Bloomberg terminals in London, the trade volume for the Saudi Arab light crude oil contract spiked to infinity and then immediately flatlined. Professional traders reported witnessing a massive liquidity gap. They attempted to execute trades, but their screens froze solid. The complex algorithms that manage the global energy market threw up a very specific error code, ERR 404 settlement path not found. The mainstream financial news outlets, such as CNBC, Bloomberg, and the Financial Times, are currently labeling it a technical glitch. They are pointing fingers at a software patch at Swift headquarters in Belgium, telling the public it was a mere server error. They are lying to you. What happened at 3 a.m. was not a glitch, it was a funeral. While the U.S. banking system was asleep, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia and the People's Bank of China executed the largest non-dollar energy transaction in human history. $5 billion worth of crude oil was settled in just 4 seconds. And here is the specific detail that should terrify every person holding a U.S. passport. Not one single cent of that trade touched the U.S. banking system. They didn't utilize SWIFT. They didn't utilize the dollar. They didn't use a correspondent bank in New York. They utilized a protocol known as mBRIDGE. Today, I am going to walk you through the transaction hash that effectively killed the petrodollar. I'm going to deconstruct the code of this new system and show you why the exorbitant privilege of the United States just evaporated into thin air, and why the inflation arriving next month won't be transitory, it will be permanent. To comprehend the violence of what just occurred, you must understand the financial prison we have inhabited for 50 years. We call it SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. They claim SWIFT is a neutral messaging system, but that is a fabrication. SWIFT is a weapon. For the last half-century, if China desired to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they essentially had to ask for America's permission. Here's the anatomy of an old world trade. Step 1. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, takes yuan from a refinery. Step 2. They sell that yuan on the open market to acquire US dollars, which artificially supports the dollar's value. Step 3. They send a SWIFT message to a correspondent bank in New York, typically JP Morgan or Citibank. Step 4. JP Morgan reviews the trade, checking sanctions lists and the political climate. If the U.S. president is satisfied, they approve it. Step 5. JP Morgan moves the dollars from the Chinese account to the Saudi account. Step 6. 3 days later, the Saudi bank confirms receipt. Do you see the trap? Every barrel of oil sold globally required the U.S. dollar. This created a permanent artificial demand for American currency, allowing the U.S. government to print trillions of dollars of debt, knowing foreign nations were forced to buy them to trade energy. It was the greatest economic cheat code in history. But at 3 a.m. this morning, that cheat code stopped functioning. So what exactly did Saudi Arabia do differently today? They utilized Project mBRIDGE. This is a multi-CBDC platform developed in secret by the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, in Hong Kong, involving China, Thailand, and the UAE. Western economists laughed at it, calling it a mere science experiment. They failed to realize it was a digital Death Star. mBRIDGE is not a messaging system, it is a shared ledger. It is a private blockchain that connects central banks directly. Here is what the January 4th trade looked like. At 3:01 a.m., the People's Bank of China issues a digital yuan token on the mBRIDGE ledger, fully backed by yuan reserves. At 3:02 a.m., the Saudi Central Bank, SAMA, verifies the token on their node. At 3:03 a.m., the ownership of the token transfers from Beijing to Riyadh. By 3:04 a.m., the settlement is complete. Peer-to-peer. No JP Morgan, no New York, no sanctions check, and no 3-day waiting period. The money essentially teleported. Because this occurred on a private ledger, the Federal Reserve in New York didn't even realize it happened until the oil tanker manifest was updated several hours later. This is precisely why the screens froze. The algorithms are programmed to identify a correlation. If oil moves, dollars must move. But this morning, oil moved, and the dollar stood still. The correlation broke. The machine gasped for air. We witnessed the first liquidity vacuum of the post-dollar era. $5 billion of demand for the US dollar simply ceased to exist. You might be asking, archivist, why didn't the CIA stop this? Why didn't Wall Street foresee it? Because they fell into the MVP trap, minimum viable product. For the last 2 years, the West has been arrogant. They looked at mBRIDGE and saw small test volumes, a few million here and there. The Wall Street Journal wrote articles claiming mBRIDGE is clunky and can't handle the liquidity of the oil market. They treated it like a tech startup demo. However, China and Saudi Arabia play a different game. They weren't testing the software, they were testing the pipes. They were stress testing the nodes to see if they could handle a massive whale transaction. While the West was distracted by the stock market and the election cycle, Aramco, the Saudi oil giant, was quietly integrating mBRIDGE into their sales terminals. The $5 billion trade this morning wasn't a pilot. It was the go-live. It was the announcement that the system is fully operational. Saudi Arabia didn't just dip a toe in, they did a cannonball. This confirms the rumor I mentioned in my December dossier. Saudi Arabia has officially terminated the 1974 Petrodollar Pact. They didn't hold a press conference or sign a treaty. They just updated their payment software. With one click, 50 years of American financial hegemony was deleted. There is one specific detail in the January 4th protocol that forensic analysts are obsessing over right now: the concept of atomic settlement. This is the technical reason why the dollar cannot compete. In the old SWIFT system, there is massive counterparty risk. Saudi Arabia sends the oil on Tuesday, but they get the money on Friday. In those 3 days, a bank can fail, a government can freeze assets, or a war can erupt. It is slow and dangerous. mBRIDGE introduces smart contracts to the oil trade. The January 4th protocol utilized a payment via delivery, PVED, script. The money moves if and only if the digital title to the oil transfers. It happens simultaneously in the same block. If the money doesn't arrive, the oil title doesn't move. If the oil title doesn't move, the money doesn't leave. Zero risk. Why does this matter? Because it makes the US dollar technologically inferior. Using the dollar is now slower, riskier, and more expensive than using the digital yuan on mBRIDGE. The US dollar has lost its network effect. It is like trying to run a modern corporation using a fax machine when your competitor is using encrypted email. Even if you love the fax machine, even if you have used it for 50 years, you cannot compete. Aramco is a business. They chose the superior technology. And that technology just happens to be the one that bypasses the United States entirely. Let's play this forward. Today it was $5 billion, but Aramco exports $200 billion of oil annually to Asia. If 20% of that trade moves to mBRIDGE, that is $40 billion of demand for the US dollar that vanishes. If 50% moves, that is $100 billion. Where do those dollars go? They don't just disappear. When China doesn't need dollars to buy oil, they sell their dollar reserves. They dump US treasuries. Those dollars come home, flooding back into the US domestic economy. It is a tidal wave of currency that has been trapped offshore for decades, suddenly washing up on the shores of New York and California. This is the textbook definition of hyperinflation. The glitch at 3 a.m. wasn't just a computer error, it was the first tremor of an earthquake that is going to shatter the US bond market. But there is one giant gaping hole in this story, one question that every skeptic is screaming right now. Why would Saudi Arabia accept yuan? The yuan is a controlled currency. It is trapped in China and subject to the whims of Beijing. Saudi Arabia isn't stupid. They know the risks of swapping American masters for Chinese masters. They wouldn't kill the petrodollar just to get stuck with a petro-yuan they can't use, unless that digital yuan wasn't just paper, unless there was a second part to the January 4th protocol that the media missed entirely, unless that transaction had a backdoor built into the code. In the next section, I'm going to show you the Shanghai convertibility clause. I'm going to explain how China convinced the House of Saud to dump the dollar by offering them a golden key that opens the vaults of the Shanghai Gold Exchange, and why the oil you buy next year might actually be priced in grams of gold. We witnessed the murder of the petrodollar. We saw $5 billion of oil move on the mBRIDGE ledger, bypassing New York entirely. But we were left with a burning question that breaks the brains of Western economists. Why would Saudi Arabia accept Chinese yuan? The yuan is subject to capital controls. If President Xi Jinping wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, he can devalue it by 10% before breakfast. The House of Saud knows this. They are survivors, not gamblers. They would never swap the king dollar for the risky yuan. So, How did China convince them? They didn't offer a currency, they offered a gateway. Embedded in the smart contract of the January 4th Protocol is a specific line of code that we are calling the Shanghai Convertibility Clause. It works like this. When Aramco receives the digital yuan tokens on mBRIDGE, they have a 12-hour window. During that window, those tokens are legally defined not as currency, but as warehouse receipts. They are instantly convertible at a fixed spot price into physical gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, SGE. Do you understand the brilliance of this trap? Saudi Arabia isn't holding yuan. They are holding gold futures priced in yuan. The Chinese currency is just the tunnel the value travels through. The yuan exists for exactly 4 seconds, the time it takes to swap the oil title for the gold title. This is the risk-free trade. Saudi Arabia doesn't have to trust the Chinese Communist Party. They only have to trust that the gold bars sitting in the Shanghai vault are real. Unlike the US dollar, which can be printed to infinity, gold cannot be diluted by a politician in Washington. To truly understand the magnitude of this shift, we must go back to June 8, 1974. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh on a secret mission. The U.S. economy was crumbling, inflation was rampant, and the dollar was dying because we had just abandoned the gold standard. Kissinger made the House of Saud an offer they couldn't refuse. 1. The U.S. will provide military protection and weapons to the Saudi royal family forever. 2. In exchange, Saudi Arabia must price every single barrel of oil in U.S. dollars. 3. They must take those oil profits and buy U.S. Treasury bonds. That was the Petrodollar Pact. For 50 years, it forced the world to fund the American empire. If you wanted energy, you needed dollars. To get dollars, you had to sell goods to America. It allowed the U.S. to run massive deficits without consequence. But on January 4, 2026, that contract expired. Why? Because the U.S. broke its side of the deal. We weaponized the dollar, seizing Russian assets in 2022 and threatening sanctions on our allies. Saudi Arabia realized that holding U.S. treasuries wasn't savings. It was a hostage situation. If they disagreed with U.S. foreign policy, their bank accounts could be frozen overnight. The mBRIDGE protocol is the escape hatch. By moving to a gold-backed settlement, Saudi Arabia has traded American protection for financial sovereignty. They don't need U.S. treasuries anymore. They are building a fortress of gold bars in Riyadh paid for by the Chinese energy market. The petrodollar, oil for debt, is dead. The petrogold, oil for assets, has been born. Now let's examine the mechanics of the gold market, because this is where the physical squeeze happens. China is the world's largest gold producer and importer. The Shanghai Gold Exchange is draining the West. The convertibility clause requires massive amounts of physical metal to function. If Aramco sells $5 billion of oil, that is roughly 60 tons of gold that needs to be available for immediate allocation. Where does that gold come from? It comes from London, Switzerland, and the COMEX in New York. For the last 18 months, we have seen a mysterious migration of bullion moving east. Western analysts called it central bank hoarding. They were half right. It was pre-positioning. China was filling the vaults of the SGE to ensure they had enough liquidity to back the oil trade. They knew that the moment mBRIDGE went live, the demand for gold would explode. This creates a terrifying feedback loop for the West. 1. Saudis sell oil for yuan. 2. Saudis dump yuan for gold. 3. SGE drains global gold supply. 4. Gold price skyrockets. 5. US dollar purchasing power collapses against real assets. We are watching the demonetization of the dollar in real time. Value is fleeing the paper system and hiding in the hard asset system. If you want physical proof, look at the flight logs. Look at the cargo manifests out of Hong Kong International Airport. Since 4 a.m. this morning, there has been an unusual spike in high-value secure cargo flights headed for Riyadh, armored transport, and private charters. The digital ledger settles the trade in seconds, but the atomic settlement requires the physical metal to eventually move. Saudi Arabia isn't leaving the gold in China. They are taking delivery. They are physically moving the wealth of the world from the factory of the East to the vault of the desert. The U.S. Navy, which patrols the oceans to protect free trade, is powerless to stop it. You can blockade a ship, but you cannot blockade a blockchain transaction. You cannot sanction a ledger that you cannot see. So the Saudis have their gold, the Chinese have their oil, and the mBRIDGE system is working perfectly. But there is a third party in this divorce, a party currently sitting on $34 trillion of debt that relied on the petrodollar to stay solvent, the United States Treasury. When Saudi Arabia stops buying treasuries, who funds the military or social security? The January 4th Protocol didn't just change the oil market, it triggered a margin call on the American empire. In the next section, I'm going to show you the bond market massacre and why the Federal Reserve has called an emergency meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow. We have established the geopolitical crime. Saudi Arabia and China bypass the dollar. We have established the financial mechanism. They are using mBRIDGE to swap oil for gold. But now we must talk about the victim, and it isn't a politician or a bank, it is you. Because right now, a specific alarm is ringing on the trading floor of the U.S. Treasury Department. It is the alarm for the 10-year Treasury yield. For 50 years, the Petrodollar deal forced Saudi Arabia to buy U.S. government debt. They were our buyer of last resort, keeping our interest rates low. They allowed Americans to have 3% mortgages because they were subsidizing our lifestyle. But at 3 a.m., when Saudi Arabia switched to mBRIDGE, they stopped buying, and worse, they started selling. To buy gold on the Shanghai exchange, they need liquidity. They are liquidating their U.S. Treasury portfolio, and China is doing the same. They are dumping trillions of dollars of American debt onto a market that already has no buyers. This is the bond market massacre. When everyone sells a bond, the price crashes and the interest rate explodes. Right now, the 10-year yield just spiked above 6.5%. You might think that sounds boring, but you are wrong. You are the bond market. The 10-year Treasury is the reference rate for the entire global economy. Your 30-year mortgage and car loan are priced off it. When China and Saudi Arabia walk away, there's no one left to hold the bag. Interest rates are going up because the market is forcing them to. The world is looking at $35 trillion of U.S. debt and saying, give us real assets. If the 10-year yield sticks at 7%, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate goes to 12%. Overnight. Do you know what happens to the U.S. housing market at 12% interest? It freezes. Nobody can afford to buy or sell. Home values implode and the equity in your house evaporates. Corporate America runs on cheap debt. At 10% interest, the stock buyback machine stops. The stock market, addicted to cheap leverage, faces a margin call of biblical proportions. The January 4th protocol just popped the everything bubble. This brings us to the emergency meeting at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Jerome Powell and the Fed governors have two choices, both leading to disaster. Choice A, defend the dollar by raising rates to 15% to bribe the Saudis back. Result, the U.S. government goes bankrupt and the economy collapses immediately. Choice B, defend the bond market by printing trillions to buy the debt no one else wants. Result, hyperinflation. They will choose option B. They will sacrifice the dollar to save the government. There's one final signal that the panic is here, the repo market. This is the plumbing of the financial system where banks lend to each other overnight. At 4:15 a.m., the repo rate spiked to 10%. That means banks do not trust each other. JP Morgan doesn't know if Citibank is holding the toxic bonds being dumped, so they stop lending. The gears of the system are grinding to a halt. We are hours away from a liquidity freeze where ATMs stop working. The mBRIDGE transaction was the first domino. The repo spike is the last one before the bank run. The trap has sprung. The Saudis and Chinese have exited, and the Fed is about to print the dollar into oblivion. You're in a burning building, and the exits marked stocks and bonds are locked, but the door marked hard assets is still open. We have analyzed the crime scene, and the diagnosis is terminal. The era of paper wealth, stocks, bonds, and dollars, is ending. When the petrodollar dies, those promises are broken. We are entering the hard asset era. The world is splitting into two economies, the dying system economy and the sovereign economy backed by energy and gold. Here is the archivist's exit protocol. Rule number 1, if you can't hold it, you don't own it. Don't buy gold ETFs like GLD. They are a trap. In a crisis, they have the right to settle your shares in cash. You will be forced to take dollars while real gold trades at a massive premium on the black market. You must own allocated physical metal outside the banking system. Be like the Saudi Central Bank. Ask for physical delivery. Rule number 2, front-run the import shock. The strong dollar allowed Americans to import cheap goods, but that is reversing. When the dollar loses its status, everything from abroad becomes expensive. We are talking about a currency devaluation event where laptops cost $3,000 and coffee is $15. Buy your durable goods today. This is personal infrastructure capital allocation. Rule number 3, eliminate the middleman. The U.S. banking system is the middleman. Get your crypto onto a hardware wallet and your cash out of systemically important banks. In a crisis, the middleman always protects himself first. Self-custody is the only way to be uncancelable. You need to build your own personal mBRIDGE so the bank can't turn off your life savings. Finally, understand the psychology of what is coming. The mBRIDGE system is a barter network. In the future, credit scores won't matter. What matters is what you have. Do you have energy, food, skills, and gold? These are the only things that trade in a post-dollar world. Financial advisors telling you to diversify into 60% stocks and 40% bonds are offering a suicide pact. They are diversifying you into two versions of the same paper promises. The only true diversification is outside the system. January 4th, 2026 will be known as the day the music stopped. The technical glitch was the sound of the Global South unplugging the American ATM. The Saudis and Chinese have chosen real assets. You still have a choice while the window is open, but it is closing fast. Don't be the person waiting in line at the bank when the doors are locked. The 4-second warning has sounded. What you do in the next 24 hours will determine your destiny. This is Archivist. The protocol is active. Class dismissed.